Hello all, and welcome to PHP Dublin. Glad to be back after the hiatus in these strange times. Today we have a very special talk from Rasmus Lerdorf on Modern PHP, which I personally am very much looking forward to. Just so everyone knows, what's going to happen is we're going to have a 40 to 50-minute talk session, and then there will be a QA section afterwards, and it'll probably be 10 to 20 minutes. So without further ado, let's kick things off. Rasmus?
Hello, everyone. I hate virtual talks. Let me just start by saying that. I've been avoiding them for over a year now, but finally people convinced me to do one. I'm sure I'm going to be quite bad at it, but I'll do my best. So I think we have about 75 people watching, which is cool. It's a decent sized talk. I really wish I could see everyone. And I really wish I could be in Dublin and have a beer with everyone afterwards, but that's not happening yet. So my talk is online, as always, talks.php.net, Dublin 2021 for this one. Twitter @Rasmus. So I'm in the wrong window there. So at Etsy, we use PHP quite a bit, and people call Etsy a PHP shop, which is not quite accurate. Any large company these days uses all sorts of technologies, and there are big chunks of the company that never touch PHP. There's a ton of other technologies all over the company, but we do use a lot of PHP. This is what our architecture looks like, a very simplified version of the architecture. A bunch of CDNs, well, I think we're down to 2 CDNs now, actually. So 2 CDNs run the Google stack. So we have the global load balancer out in front of our managed instances, and we have a number of different stacks below that. I'm just showing 2 of them here. We have a web stack, we have an API stack. So there's a public API, and also the mobile will connect directly to the API. Then there's an internal load balancer that then sits in front of a bunch of internal services, not just an API. There are other bits as well. There's a fan out layer, which is pretty interesting. So from the webs, the APIs, and from other stacks too, we will use a multi-curl based fan out. So we can send parallel requests to the API and fill in the UI from there. Lots of asynchronous things happening. We have Gearman for longer running async things, so we can kick off a job and come back and check on it later. We can also kick it off synchronously if we want. Obviously, lots of logging and statsd stuff as well. There's a beacon stack. There's a whole bunch of things behind this, but all of it looks kind of like this architecture. And we do stress the API. Everything these days is going directly to the API. We don't use someone else's framework. We have our own, including writing our own ORM. That's been around for 10+ years now. Please don't do that. This is not a great idea to write your own ORM or your own framework. You should take some existing technologies and massage it to fit your needs. Writing your own ORM is just going to be a pain over the years, as it has been at Etsy. But it's so ingrained in our technology stack that it's really hard to swap it out for something else. So it's there. Generally, the architecture is quite MVC-like. Request routing is done at the sort of the dumbest way possible, just with htaccess Apache rewrite rules. We do have tools that actually compile these routes for us, so we're not always directly editing regexes and htaccess files. So we have tools that help a little bit with that. But this example here basically shows that if you go to awesome/123 on etsy.com, that regex will kick in and send it off to an index page called awesome.php. The little flags there is like L is the last rule, NC non-case sensitive, and QSA means append the query string to the end of it. And then we're also adding that ID, turning the ID from the URL into a get parameter for that index script. That script then looks something like this. So we have a Bootstrap layer that bootstraps the whole Etsy architecture. We bring in the request and response, usually, not always, not all endpoints need that. And that either gets passed directly to the controller or will pass the request and response to methods that the controller exposes to us. So we have a controller for this endpoint called AwesomeController with a do cool things method in it, in this case, and that would look something like this. So very, very straightforward, really. So here we pick out the ID from a get parameter, and there's sanitization, obviously, that goes there. So you can't inject weird stuff into it. Redirect to an error page if this thing's not found in this case. Then you can either call directly into the ORM, which is that Etsy ORM call there, or you can fan out to the API, or do both. And then we hand it off to the view layer. And that tends to be a tree of templates. For really simple stuff, it might just be one template, but generally be a tree of templates that has a template for each component of that page. So the view will look something like this. It basically just defines which templates to use in this particular case. CSS, you can also put a get.js file, so for JavaScript stuff in here. Then a get template data will basically fill in the variables for the template. So in this particular case, we're exposing thing ID, thing name, and stuff. And stuff in this case, you can see came in as an array. So we have an array of stuff going in and an ID and a name. And then templating, we've been migrating away from Smarty to Mustache. All new things are in Mustache now. So the template for this might look like this, right? Where we expose the thing name, the thing ID, and then loop over the stuff array in this case, and pick out the ID and description column from each array row in this case. So pretty simple architecture, actually. If you looked at the code, you wouldn't necessarily agree. And the Etsy folks watching this talk will say there's nothing simple about this, but sort of at the high level, it isn't very complicated. The nitty-gritty gets somewhat complicated. Oops, where am I? Okay. So to help us figure out some of this code when it gets complicated, we use Stag Analysis quite a bit. So Fan was a project I started while at Etsy because I really, really needed a fast static analyzer. Etsy has a lot of code, and there were some other static analyzers around when I started Fan, but they were too slow, and they were based on PHP 5 and building their own AST. So PHP 5 did not have an abstract syntax tree built in. PHP 7 does. It's based on part of actually running a PHP script these days is PHP building the AST and then executing opcodes generated from that AST. So Fan pulls the AST directly out of PHP and uses that. It means it can scan quite a bit faster than most other static analyzers. And I really needed fast scanning for this because I needed to run this. I needed every developer at Etsy to run this all the time. So you can install it yourself for your projects. You can do composer require -- dev fan. There's a small config file you can put in .fan config.php with a target version. You don't have to use a target version. You'll use whatever your current version is if you don't tell it. But if you're upgrading, for example, you could set your target. If you're currently on 7.4, you could set your target to 8 and have Fan scan your code for issues that you might run into for the upgrade, and also prevent people from committing new code that's not compatible with the version you're heading towards. Those two extra lines there, directory list says, here's where my source code lives, scan and report any errors in that code. You can do exclude analysis, and you can say everything under vendor, pull it in so that dependencies are resolved, but don't tell me about other people's problems, basically. You don't necessarily want to know that various components you're depending on have various issues, right? They're not really under your control. Sometimes it's fun scanning them just to see how bad the code is that you depend on, but it doesn't help you much to do that all the time. And then you just run it, vendor bin fan, and that will scan your code. You can do a demo online if you want to play with it before using it. So fan GitHub IO demo. It looks like this. Here I put a little bit of code in, sort of a very standard user class. Has a constructor, you pass in an array. And one of the interesting things about fan and other static analyzers is that you can mark up beyond PHP's built-in typing. You can extend it quite a bit. So in this case, I have added a shaped array. I've said that this array, user array has to have an element with index ID, and the value for the ID index has to be an integer. It also has to have a name element, and the value for that element has to be a string. And if it's not, it's going to complain. So in this case, if I analyze it, you'll see it's complaining because I'm passing in an integer and a string, but fan is saying, you passed in as 0, 1 indices. The shape says you should pass in ID and name indices. I mean, if I run this code, you'll also see that at runtime we get problems because PHP is expecting indices, ID, and name. But by being able to do this via Stag Analysis beforehand, it means you don't hit a runtime error and you can catch these things much earlier. So if we fix that and use the fixed version here, we can analyze it and fan is happy and the code is happy, right? Obviously, it can catch other things. Like if you misspelled this index, for example, right? We analyze it, it'll come up and say invalid offset because it knows it should have an offset named name, but it isn't there. And it'll catch all kinds of other things. Obviously, if you run this one, we also have issues because this doesn't exist. But it will catch most things that end up being errors at the PHP level. Not all things. You can do crazy things. You can do dollar var stuff, which is really hard to statically analyze. So you do have to be a little bit careful about how you write your code if you want to cater more to static analysis, which is a little bit sad because I love my triple equals. Well, not necessarily triple equals, but I love my double equal PHP code. I think it's an awesome feature, but whatever. So there's another piece. I wrote a dependency graph plugin for Fan, which is pretty cool. I have it running here on, there's an open source project called Grav, which is like a blogging platform. And what this picture tells you is I asked it for the dependencies of the trait Grav common file compiled file. So that's the trait. And there are apparently 3 classes that depend on that trait directly. I can go out to 2 levels to see the dependencies of each of these 3 now. Now we see that the things that depend on it. And you can zoom around and zoom in and out. If we go out further, see it gets more and more complex. And at a certain level, it doesn't become super useful anymore. You can also do it by file name. So if you put a file name instead, you get line numbers in these files. It tells you so on line 103 of this particular file, there's a dependency on compiled JSON file. And then that has a dependency on the thing we're looking for. So it's a fun little plugin to give you sort of a picture of how everything hangs together. Fan also has a daemon mode, which basically lets you pre-analyze and build the entire graph for the code that you're analyzing and keep that in memory. If you don't have much code, you don't really need it. If you have hundreds of thousands of lines of code, it can take a minute or 2 to scan the whole thing. And by having it in memory, you can run this fan client -L on a piece of code, and it'll give you errors instantly, almost instantly at least. And that means you can do stuff like Vim integration or any other editor as well. So I've pre-baked it, or actually I stole this, but just to avoid presentation failures here. So if we're VIing a file, we make a mistake, we go to save it, and fan kicks in and says, you have an error right there. So it's kind of cool to get instant feedback. Kind of the same thing you can get from PHP Storm. They have similar things built in, not based on fan, but fan being a standalone Stag Analyzer lets you plug it into other IDEs and editors. Another tool we use every now and then, especially when things go badly, we use PHP Spy, which is also a tool written at Etsy by Adam Saponara. Check out his GitHub page and check out the tool there. What it does is it samples in real time running PHP code without any overhead. So you can run it on production code. So it's not like Xdebug or other debuggers that you really don't want to run in production because it slows down your running code because it has to instrument it. This thing peaks at the memory, and it'll take peaks at whatever interval you tell it in nanoseconds. So in this case, I'm telling it every 200 milliseconds, have a look at what my process is doing. And in this case, you can see my process is just sleeping. So every 200 milliseconds, I'm asking, what are you doing? I'm sleeping, 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 sleeping. And you see I get 5 of these responses, which makes sense because it's sleeping for 1 second. So 5 times 200 milliseconds, we get 5 of these, and then the process dies, and now it's not doing anything. Doesn't seem super useful, but once you build on that, you can do interesting things. So here I'm pointing it to a web server that was running WordPress. And I'm asking it, hey, what are you doing? And I get a call stack at every interval to see what this process is doing at that point. You can get memory usage on each of those stack frames as well. If you ask for it, PHP Spy -M, and it'll tell you how much memory we're using at this particular stack frame. There's also a top-like output. Hold on. So I can run top here locally, and in another window, you can't see this, but I'm just going to run fan, and that will pop up in a second. So here you can see basically kind of like normal top on Linux, right? You can see what's actually being called and what's being used a lot, which is interesting to see if execution is in the areas of the code, or the most time is spent in the areas of the code that you expect. And top is a kind of interesting view of that. There are other views you can do. So you can generate a flame graph. So in this case, I'm also doing it on Fan, PHP Spy Fan, because Fan is a nice, long-running, complicated project that's interesting to analyze. And you spit out this flame graph like this, and it looks like that. So here we can sort of read it from the bottom up. Let's say we have a bunch of samples. We can go see, okay, so the analyzed file is taking a while. So we can click on that and zoom in. And out of analyzed file, it looks like kind visitor implementation invoke. It's taking lots of time. So we can keep zooming in, analyze and get updated context, and then visit if is taking time. And out of visit if, this one, and then this one seems to be taking the most time. And you can keep going in and see like, hey, this is not supposed to be taking this much time, or I really was not expecting this shape. I was expecting this part to take a lot more time. So maybe I need to go and optimize this part of the code over here. So flame graphs are really cool for that. And it's very easy to build a flame graph with Fan, or sorry, with PHP Spy. All right, so we've debugged it. Now let's try to deploy it. So how do we do that? So at Etsy, we have some requirements for our deploys. We have to have atomic deploys because we deploy sometimes dozens of times a day. It's not like we have a deploy every 2 weeks like some companies do. Whenever a developer has code that they want to push, they push it, basically. So our deploy mechanism has to have zero performance hit. We can't have it negatively impacting our users every time we push code, because we push code all the time. And it has to be atomic in the sense that while it's pushing, it can't screw up existing requests that are executing at that time. And in order to do that, we can't restart the web servers. We can't remove servers from the load balancer. We have to avoid any sort of thundering herd on cold caches. And then we basically, to do that, we have to reuse our cache as much as possible. So in order to do that, we basically keep two versions of the site, directory A and directory B. So two document roots. So as we come in and deploy, A in this case is live, and there are a bunch of requests running when the deploy happens. So the deploy happens here on the red dotted line, and we have a bunch of requests that started before the deploy, and they will finish after the deploy. So that means that we will have requests that as soon as we deploy, new requests will start on the other doc root, on B, while requests are still finishing on A. So we have requests in flight on two different versions of the code base at the same time. And that just has to work. So in order to make that work, we make sure that any request that starts on A must finish on A. And in order to do that, we set the document root to the target of a symlink. So basically, with these two directories of var.wwa and var.wb, we have a symlink called current that we can flip between A and B. So if we're on B, we'll deploy the new version to A and then flip it to that doc root. You can do that in Nginx pretty easily. That's built in. There's this thing called realpath _root that you can set your document root to, and that will then do a real path on the symbolic link if your document root is pointing to a symbolic link. Apache doesn't have that feature, so I wrote an Apache extension to do this called mod realdoc that will set the document root at the start of the request. Before it hands off to PHP, it'll set it to the target of that current symlink. A few things you have to watch out for with this type of deploy mechanism. You can't hard code paths. So you can't hard code var.ww.a or var.ww.b. And you can't hard code var.ww.current either. You can't use the actual paths on the drive directly. You have to make everything relative to the document root or to the include path. And as long as your include path is set intelligently, then everything will just work. And we also have an extension called incpath, which will massage your include path in case you do have directories in that path that points to var.ww current, that points to your symlink. That will get replaced on every request to the current live document root at that point. It also means that you really should version all your static assets, because you're going to have version 11 of the code running at the same time as version 12 of the code. And there's only going to be, they're going to have static asset requests that they make while they're doing this. And the old version might expect the old version of the asset, and the new version might expect the new version. But as long as you version your assets, that shouldn't be an issue. Of course, any sort of centralized services like DBs with schemas, if the old version of the code expects the old schema and the new one expects the new one, you can't run both versions at the same time. So if you're making schema changes, you have to coordinate that carefully, so you're not breaking requests during the deploy. All right, so this is how we deploy, but how do we actually at the people level, how do we manage hundreds of developers deploying their code without stepping on each other, without breaking the site, since we're doing it dozens of times a day? So we coordinate everything via chatting, basically. So it used to be IRC, now it's Slack. So there's a push channel when you have code to push, you join the push channel and you type .join. So here is me hopping into the push channel and saying .join. Then there's a push bot that says, hey, Rasmus, and adds me to the push queue, we call it. This is showing that Joe and Frank are currently pushing. And then this pipe here says that Bob and Rasmus are waiting in the queue for the next push. When Joe and Frank are done, when they both said, hey, this my stuff is .good, they get a little asterisk next to their name in the title. And Joe, who's driving the push, says everything is good, I'm done. The next group is up. And the push bot tells us that and alerts us. So if you're off doing other things, you'll get a Slack alert saying, hey, it's your turn now. Then you git push your code to master, to main now. We've renamed it, sorry. And once your code is in, you say, my code is in. You get a little asterisk. Then the person who's first in line, in this case, Bob, is driving the push. And you can control push bots in these ways. So join.in when the code has been pushed, good when things are okay, uh-oh when things are bad. You can hold the queue in case there's some big problem. You can leave the queue and then done when you're done. There are a few other commands too out there. And then the person driving uses a deploynator web app to basically just press a button. So you press a button to run your code through the staging and testing on what's called Princess. And then once those tests are done, you deploy it to production by pressing that button. So it's basically a 2-button deploy, but you have to sit around in Slack and wait for your turn. So here we're now on Princess. We are running tests. Once all those tests have succeeded, if they succeed, if they don't succeed, you have to go figure out, is it my code? Is it just a flaky test? What's happening? But assuming everything is good, everyone says .good, get your little asterisks, and you're ready to push on to production. When you actually hit that push to production on the deploynator webpage, something behind the scenes will SSH to the deploy host and then do a distributed shell command to all the targets and rsync files to the non-live out of the AB document routes, and we'll put it on the non-live one. And then once that everything has been pushed out, it'll then deshell out a symlink swap from A to B. And once that's all done, Bob says done, pushbot says clear, there's no one left to push, we're all done, which is very rare to see at Etsy. There's always a long line of people waiting to push code to production. Of course, while all this is happening, we are graphing everything, lots of stats-D and tons of Grafana graphs, lots of monitoring on all the servers. Logging everything, of course. We have a tool that we built called Supergrab that's basically just concatenates all the logs from all the servers on one web page. And that can get a little crazy sometimes, especially when there are things that are broken. That thing will scroll so fast and kill your browser. Usually when that's happening, you know there's a problem. Your browser is lagging. It's because something is going bad on Etsy. Logstash, Elasticsearch, MTEL, and Prometheus being used quite a bit for this. We do commit, I have to fix this. We just switched from master to main. I really have to fix my slides, sorry. We deploy from head. We don't use branches. We've talked about it. We're currently not using branches. Basically, our branches are in code under feature flags. So if you have a new feature that's not ready for the world yet, you put it behind the feature flag, and that flag may say only for Etsy employees for a while, or only for yourself for a while. And then you can ramp that up to like 1% of all Etsy users or 50% of all Etsy users. And that's your way of kind of branching and slowly rolling things out just to make sure everything is okay. And then when things aren't okay, it's very, very important that you can actually figure out what happened. And I've worked for a lot of companies that were really bad at this step, where you're always looking to figure out what was the root cause, who caused this. There's always the question I heard at other companies, and That really doesn't work, because it means people are always hiding and trying to figure out, well, it wasn't me. What must have been that guy, right? With a culture of blameless postmortems where you're really not trying to blame anyone. You're trying to figure out, how did the system fail, right? The fact that one person can break the site is not that person's fault. It can't be that person's fault. If it is, your company is broken, right? One person should not be able to break the site. The system has failed if one person broke the site and nobody noticed. And that's what you try to get to the bottom of in a blameless postmortem, is figure out where your systemic failure was. All right. So on the PHP side of things, this is where we are in the world right now. If you are running one of the red versions here, you should basically stop watching this talk right now and go fix that and upgrade. You should be at least in the orange or the green. At Etsy, we're currently on 7.3, so I am running out of time. I am working on the upgrade we're going straight from 7.3 to PHP 8 later on this year. But we have quite compacted the timeline for versions in the PHP world. We used to go way longer between releases, and it tended to be bad for morale for developers who are working on the project. It's much nicer knowing that your code that you've been working so hard on is actually going to see life soon and not 6 years down the road. It's very demotivating when your code that you've been working so hard on does not get used. So by having these shorter timelines, it's been much healthier for the project. And by also making it very, very regular, we push a new version of PHP at the end of every year, or we have for the last many years. And when people know, okay, at the end of the year, there's a new version, and this is going to be how long it's going to be alive, this is how long it's going to be supported, it's much easier to plan for. We've also been pretty good at improving PHP over the years. There was a massive jump from PHP 5 to PHP 7 in performance, as you can see. This is requests per second on just a very generic WordPress install, 20 concurrent requests. The improvement, once we hit 7, has been smaller, much smaller, obviously. The jump here from 5 to 7 was really completely rewriting memory management in PHP and not pushing so much data around between the different parts of PHP. Obviously, the latency has dropped similarly. They go hand in hand, of course. So you can expect a bit of a performance boost, depending on how many versions you're skipping. If you're still on PHP 5, then you're kind of lucky, because your site is going to speed up by a lot once you get onto any version of PHP 7 or 8. But even if you're on 7.1 and you're jumping to 8, for example, you're still going to see a decent boost. All right, so PHP 8. This was our most recent release from November. Some of the main features in it, you can now do named arguments. This is quite useful for when you have a bunch of default arguments, right? And you want to set this last optional argument. And it's also easier to read that I'm setting double encode to false and leaving the defaults for the other arguments to HTML chars. Otherwise, you basically had to figure out what the defaults were and stick them in order to get to that last optional argument, which is not very handy. Constructive property promotion. This basically gets rid of a bunch of boilerplate code. So instead of passing in string first name, last name, password, and int, and then saying this first name equals first name, this does it all in one go. So it promotes the arguments coming into the constructor directly to properties that you can then go and access just with that. So there's no other code needed to make this work. And it does remove a bunch of boilerplate code that's not useful to have around. There's also a null safe operator. The null safe operator checks to see if something is null, right? And it has short circuiting, which means that if user was null here, then GUIP is never going to get called because it short circuits before it ever gets there. So it's equivalent to this old style code here of checking each component as you go. Match expression, kind of like switch, but it's an expression, means it returns a value. So you can have it return the actual value of the match. Instead of in a switch case where you have to assign to statement in each case, you can just figure out which one did it match and then set statement to that. And it'll also throw directly, if you don't have a default case like I do here, but if you didn't have one and none of these matched, then it'll throw an unhandled match error that you can catch. Union types. So without union types, you might have code like this. If you want to do runtime type checking but you don't have a single type, so this key can either be int or string, and the value can be int, float, or string in this case, then you have to write quite a bit of code to have runtime type checking on that. With union types, you can reduce this same code to this. So int or string, and it'll do the runtime type check for you. You do have to be a little bit careful moving that, because here you're doing what I call soft type checks, in the sense that your Stag Analyzer will catch if you pass in the key of the wrong type. In this case, this is a hard type check, which means you get a fatal type error at runtime if you pass in the wrong type. And if your code is not ready for that yet, you'd rather catch it with Stag Analysis earlier than have your production site go down. Weakmap is a bit of a complicated feature, but Weakmap is used if you need to map objects to arbitrary values, usually in a cache sense. So in this case, I'm making a cache with a Weakmap, and it's caching an API endpoint mechanism. So this is just the thing that goes to an API endpoint and gets the contents and then caches that. So the second time you call this API function, it won't have to go and contact the endpoint. So I'm using xkcd, and icon has dad joke. And these are my two endpoints that I'm getting stuff from. So I'm fetching the xkcd image, putting an image out there, and then I'm fetching a joke. And I'm checking how big is my cache. So it should be 2 at this point. And I have it running here. I can refresh it. So here we can see we have our xkcd of the day. We have some stupid dad joke, and there's 2 items in the cache at that point. We can unset one of them. We can check the cache. Cache count is now down to 1. If we call fetch joke again, we'll get the same joke. And you saw in the thing here that we got the same joke twice, right? Now, if I then go ahead and create a new object, a new endpoint object, and then fetch it, then I get a new version of it. And our cache count is up to 2. Basically because, I mean, you might say, why isn't it 1? Because this joke overwrote this joke. So this should have gone out of scope. But we hadn't run GC yet. So you can force a GC to basically clean up these outstanding ones that haven't been collected yet, if it's important to you that it happens right away. And then the cache count will drop to 1 at this point. So at the user space level, you're probably not going to use this, but I can see people who are writing ORMs and other mechanisms in libraries will find it very, very useful to be able to weak map cache things like this. We've also added attributes, and I'm not going to explain attributes. Basically a way of marking up your code and putting extra context for your code. There's some good documentation in the doctrine ORM attributes code that explains exactly why you might want to do this. All right. Stepping away from the technical a little bit. This was me about 19 years ago working on this stuff. I've been doing this a very, very long time. I've been programming for 35 plus years now. So I'm in my 50s. And I'm still doing this stuff. I haven't become a manager. I'm still hacking away. This is my son, Karl, a little older. At a PHP conference somewhere in, I think it was in Karlsruhe in Germany, he loved to run around and unplug or find the power button on every computer in every booth and just turn it off. And it would cause havoc at the conference. And people would really dread when they saw him running. But everyone knew who he was, and they're all afraid to tell him no, because then he might start crying and run to me, and they didn't want that. So he had free roam of the entire conference to do whatever he wanted, which was pretty funny. Some of the other things over the years, I used to go to Linux Conf AU in Australia every year. This is Linus and Tridge. You may not know Tridge by sight. You probably know who Linus Torvalds is, but Tridge wrote rsync. He wrote Samba, Ccache, rsip, whole bunch of tools that you use all the time was written by this guy, one of the smartest people I know. Here he was trying to convince Linus that there was some memory lock in the kernel that he really didn't agree with, and these two just went on and on and on for an hour, and it was a lot of fun watching them fight over this one little issue in the kernel. But it's been a fun ride over the years, all the things that I've seen because of PHP. This was me in Roorkee in India. I don't wear suits. They photoshopped this suit onto me because they didn't think it was appropriate that they had a picture of me in a t-shirt for their very big, important conference. So I showed up walking up to the conference and I see this huge sign of me in this weird, ill-fitting suit. Like, okay. And these signs were all over the city too. It was crazy. This is me in Sri Lanka. This is Arthur C. Clarke. It's one of the coolest things I've ever done is I have taught Arthur C. Clarke PHP. He sat right in the front row. He asked questions. He was engaged the whole thing. It was a lot of fun. And now the coolest thing is this kid. This is a screenshot from the Etsy staff inventory, or in the Etsy staff page. He now works at Etsy, which is about one of the coolest things you could have as a dad. He's an intern. He's at the University of Waterloo, so he's not going to be around that long at Etsy, but it's still really cool. Like I said, I've been programming for over 35 years. This is my path. There are a few other little companies in between here and there I did consulting for and stuff, but this is sort of my basic path. I was ready to retire after Yahoo. I really was done. But I got bored and I just had to keep going. The thing is, I don't really like programming. I've been programming for over 35 years and it sucks. It's hard, it's tedious. It's not something I enjoy. I always compare it to flying. I would have loved to fly to Dublin to give this talk. More than anything, I would have loved to fly to Dublin, which sounds crazy because I just said I hate flying the same way I hate programming. But it's the way, it's how to do what I really want, right? With the programming, I can solve interesting problems and solve problems for real people. Just like getting on this dreaded flight, I get to meet and talk to real people and interact with real people. Programming is just a means to an end, at least for me. I'm squarely in the hacker heart here. I am not a hardcore coder. I know a lot of hardcore coders who are really, really good. And you need hardcore coders on your project or you're dead. If we didn't have Dimitri in PHP and Nikita in PHP, we would be in big trouble. Dimitri especially is a hardcore coder, right over here on the right edge. I'm sort of on the left edge of the hardcore coder spectrum. There are also lots of dreamers out there. But if you only dream, if you can only come up with, say, okay, we need Etsy search should just read your mind and give you the exact product you're looking for when you do a search. It's like, okay, well, that's not possible, right? I mean, we have to have some basis in technology so we can actually talk to each other and we can actually have a discussion how we're going to implement these ideas. So you do need some hackers in the middle here who knows how to code and who knows the limitations, but still have some dreamer left in them. And that's where I live. And I think interesting things happen there. And then what has kept me going over the years is I found ways to contribute to companies that I believe create more value than they capture, like the famous Tim O'Reilly quote. I think we're giving more back to the world than we're extracting from the world, and that's extremely important to me. So for my own quote, basically, is work on things that matter to me. And a lot of these things that I'm working on now and have been working on over the years really do matter to me. On that trip to Sri Lanka, when I met Arthur C. Clarke, I met a bunch of kids at the university there. And there had just been a tsunami and flooding, and someone had lost their grandmother, and they were devastated. And they were trying to figure out what to do about it. And we chatted, and we said, okay, when we sort of went through the fact that it was really logistics that killed her, because she wasn't actually killed by the flood. She got sick, but she couldn't get medicine. And she died a few weeks later. And they sat down and they solved this logistics issue on large catastrophes and came up with a project called Sahana, which has now been deployed in many, many, many natural disasters all around the world. This is from the Christchurch earthquake. And one of the components of this Sahana project is a people locator. So when you find someone, you either with a mobile app or on the web page, you put in their name, or this is actually for families to go and check, have you found such and such a person? It'll tell exactly if they've been found and where they are. But they have many components of how to manage a disaster. And there was a very nice quote from the Secretary of National Defense of the Philippines. No innovation matters more than that which saves lives. This is why I still do this stuff in my 50s, because it really does matter to me. But okay, I can't end on a better note than that. So I'm going to hand it off to Mark for a short public announcement, and then we'll go to Q&A.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Rasmus. That was really fantastic. So yeah, first of all, just a real quick thank you, by the way, to Barry and the Dublin PHP meetup group for giving us the time to present today. Well, for Rasmus to present today. You've all been really supportive in making today a really great success, so thank you so much. From us, or from me, I guess, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Mark Murray. I'm a senior engineering manager at Etsy. I've been here for, it seems like not so long, but it's nearly 5-6 months now. But I just want to take a minute to talk about Etsy and how it's expanding its presence in Dublin. In Dublin, we're looking to fill a number of roles all across our tech stack, even non-tech for those of you who are just jumping in for the talk today. You can take a look at our career site, or if you don't find a role that fully meets your skills or what you're currently working on today, you can come and apply anyway. We're looking at people to hire across multiple different disciplines. We'll be opening a number of roles in the next couple of weeks and months, and we've already filled a few of those already this year. Etsy's looking to expand at a rapid rate, and we really want a lot of people, especially people on this call, to come and join us, make that a success. So if you're interested, you can email us at dublin-hiring@etsy.com with your CV, or for our American friends, a resume, and we'll be in touch pretty quick. So yeah, that's all I really wanted to say. But yeah, thanks a lot again to Barry and Rasmus for making this a huge success. And yeah, I'll leave the Q&A to Barry and Rasmus.
Thanks very much for that. Thanks very much, Mark, for that message. And thank you very much, Rasmus, for that excellent talk. So the chat has been lighting up with questions. So I'm going to act as the chat's proxy right now and just read them out. So, don't shoot the messenger here, Rasmus. So start off with the first one. We've got a question here from Mark Baker. He asks, at what point in the language's long life did you realize it was going to dominate web development?
Dominate is such a strange word for this. I don't know. I don't think I ever got to the point where I thought it would dominate anything. It grew and it grew, and I noticed that, obviously. But in the early days of PHP, I wrote it because I needed it. I didn't write it to dominate anything. I wrote the tool because all the other tools at the time just didn't sit well with me. It was too damn hard to use. They were too expensive, and I couldn't be productive in them. And I also have a bad habit of just being too lazy to understand someone else's solution. So I write my own solution to things that ends up taking me 10 or 100 times longer than it would have taken me to understand the existing stuff. But back in the day, there were no better tools for it. And I always thought that this was maybe a 6 to 12 month lifespan project. Somebody is obviously going to write something better, because who the hell am I to write this thing, right? I'm not a CS person. I have an engineering degree. I know how to code. I'm decent at it. I'm not great at it. But it just kind of kept going and going and going. And then other people joined in and started making it better and better, to the point where got to the point where it was so good that I could never have written the PHP that we use today. No chance in hell am I a good enough developer to write the PHP that we all use today. It only worked because so many people pitched in. So this question of, no, I mean, it's a community that built it. So you might as well ask yourself that, Mark. You have contributed to PHP as well. When did you realize that you were going to dominate the web with PHP? Next.
Okay, so let's see. We've got a question here from, right, so I'm scrolling through here to get to them. Alan, he's asking, how do you manage the merge conflicts with multiple developers working on main?
Well, I mean, people themselves will just have to fix the merge. I mean, it doesn't happen as often as you might think. We have a pretty broad code base, and within each team has sort of their own section of the code base, and it's very rare that two developers work on exactly the same thing. But if that does happen, then the developer will just have to not push in that particular code push. When they go to push their code and they have a merge conflict and they need to take some time to figure that out, then they just drop out of that push queue, and then they'll join the next push queue when they have figured out what the heck happened. Why are two people modifying the same area of the code? So there's no magic here. It's all manual.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. Let's see here. Yes, question here from Ken Guest. He asks, what stern/coaxing words do you have in relation to getting people to at least get onto security maintained versions of PHP?
I try to do it with a carrot, not a stick, right? By promoting all the cool new features and showing the performance improvements as well. So there are all these really, really nice benefits from getting onto the new version. The hackers out there will provide the stick, right? And
Yep.
Your management, when the auditors come in and audit your technology stack, will be the stick. So I don't think I really need to do that. We as a project, we just try to make every version of PHP better, hopefully significantly better. And we also try to make the upgrade progress somewhat painless. We can't make it completely painless. There's always going to be things, but because we're releasing quite often now, if you try to keep up every year or maybe every 2 years, then the actual upgrade isn't that painful from one version to the next, because the changes aren't that big.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, we've got one here from Mark Riley. He would like to hear more about automated testing at Etsy. What do you have to do to get a code review, builds, deploy, things like that?
So we have these things called try servers. So we have Jenkins behind the scenes, and you basically type try from your terminal, and that sends a diff of all your changes to your current tree over to the try servers. It will patch that in, and it'll run all the tests on this set of try servers. So we can provide more compile power, basically, or more compute power, so that your tests run somewhat quickly. And so that's sort of the automated testing part of things. We have code coverage reports as well that tell us where tests are needed. You asked about code reviews. We don't use a lot of, well, some teams do. It's kind of team dependent. It depends on what you're working on as well. For lots of our small changes don't go through any sort of formal code review. They probably should. And we have been talking about changing that a little bit, but currently a lot of changes have no code review on them. They just, if they pass the tests, and if you're a junior developer on a team, chances are you're going to do a code review within the team. but there's no sort of company-wide mandate that you must have code reviews on all changes.
Okay, great. We got another question here from Ken, and this is one that I was thinking of myself. It's in my notes here, so I'm glad he's asking. Do you use PHP unit or BDD testing scripts like Behat, or things that make it easier for QA? I mean, what's your testing strategy?
Yes, we use both of those. We have Behat tests. We have thousands and thousands and thousands of PHP unit tests. We have, I mean, every kind of PHP test you can imagine we have, and some that you can't imagine as well, because we do some very, very nasty things with UOps, the extension that lets you override functions and things, which we really shouldn't be doing, but we have some of those as well, just because some of our code is not written well for testing. So yeah, every tool out there, we do use that. And I would, for if you're starting something new, then I would encourage you to write your code in a testable manner, and so that you can inject things into it. So you can inject methods into it for testing and things, as opposed to trying to override things at runtime with weird hacks like we've had to do.
I'm currently dealing with that and trying to move things towards that. So yeah, I feel the pain, and I agree with the sentiment. Okay, so we've got a question here about, is there, from a new person, Ken Guest, he's asking if you have anything you're excited about coming in PHP 8.1.
In 8.1, oh, I have to refresh my memory. I'm always brain dead at the end of a talk like this. Yes, I was going through the other day. Sorry, looking around my microphone. I was making some notes. Yeah, so none of the things that have been accepted yet into 8.1. So just for everyone out there, you can go to wiki.php.net/RFC, and you'll see under the implemented section, you'll see the actual RFCs that have been implemented for 8.1 so far. So the list right now, actually, I can just show it, right? So we have enumerations, deprecate passing null to non-element arguments, internal functions, array unpacking. This one's actually cool. That one I think is going to be quite useful. Some of the other ones are pretty minor, and more. This one is minor. That one's minor. There's some other things pending. We have a couple in voting right now. So we have a no return type in voting. That one I'm still trying to mull over. It does seem like a good idea. Some of the arguments for it are pretty cool, but I'm still not fully on board with the fact that we need a no return type versus just, I mean, why? Yeah, I'm not going to try to talk through all my thinking on this right now, but it's interesting. For those of you who are interested in new features, you really should go through this site every now and then and have a look at what might be coming, because it is interesting. But I guess the answer to the question is no, I'm not super excited yet about any of them, because I haven't played enough with them usually I need to sit and write some code. Mm-hmm. And I need to say, okay, now I really understand how powerful this can be, because there are quite a few things in here that, yeah, it can be useful, but it's in the real world, how useful is it really? So no, not yet, I guess is my answer.
Yeah, it isn't until the rubber hits the road that you can get a feel for it.
Yeah.
Okay, got a question here, a couple more questions. Got a question from Gariful and Michael, and he is asking about the new syntactical sugar for PHP 8, and he's worried that it might give too much freedom and that it's harder to keep consistency for code. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, PHP has never been a beautiful language. That was never the intent. PHP has always been a very, very sort of shortcut type language. This is the shortest path from A to B is PHP normally, right? It's so worrying about how pretty something looks or consistency. I mean, I like to tell people that PHP is perfectly consistent, which always makes people laugh because people think of PHP as very, very inconsistent. But it is perfectly consistent, but just vertically, not horizontally. If you understand where everything comes from in PHP, the underlying libraries, like the string functions, for example, people have been telling me string length should have an underscore in it. Like, no, this shouldn't have an underscore in it. Every C developer in the world would be so confused if string length had string underscore len. That just doesn't work. That's not string length anymore. So in that sense, it's consistent, but it's confusing and inconsistent for people who don't know where these things come from. And I think some of the new syntax sugar is kind of the same way. If you understand where it's coming from, it looks perfectly understandable and consistent. If you don't have the background to see what's coming from, then yes, I agree. It can look inconsistent, but you can fix that yourself. You can use things like Code Sniffer and others, and you can come up with your own rules for this is how we write PHP at our company or in our project. And you can enforce those rules via code sniffs. And I hate code sniffs because I don't like people telling me how to write code. But if that's important to you, then use those tools and restrict the subset of PHP that you use in your project.
Okay, great. So a follow-up question from Gareth Fulham. He is asking what your personal impression is about the RFC for fibers, which I saw on the list you showed there.
Yeah, I think it's one of these limited use type things. I can see in certain use cases, certain libraries will be helped a lot by them. I don't think any normal, I'm thinking of my colleagues at Etsy. There might be one person at Etsy that might use fibers in the library, and that library might be something we all end up using at Etsy. But it's not something that 99% of people at Etsy are going to be using for anything. It's going to be very, very specialized. And given that some of the stuff that fibers lets you do, you can't actually do in any other way. In that sense, yeah. But I don't know. I'd like to get us. It's one of these things that it could be done in an extension. I don't think it needs to be part of core PHP. And in those use cases, but the problem with that is that people have this impression that extensions are hard to install, and if your code relies on a special extension, then no one's going to use it. And to me, that's the real problem we have to solve. We have to make it much, much easier to pull in extensions, just like you do via Composer, being able to compose or install extensions directly, so that this doesn't become such a hurdle. So that if you do bring in a library that requires fibers, that also brings in the fibers extension, and it's all just smooth. And maybe it's via FFI. We'll see how we can fix that. But that, to me, that's the real issue here. And I don't necessarily think fibers needs to be part of the core PHP.
Great, that's a great answer. Thank you very much. Okay, so it's still the questions are keep coming in. So if you've got time,
I'm here as long as you want.
Great. I'm hopefully not going to make you regret that. So let's see what we've got here. Yes, considering PHP 8, there's a question from Rob Elias. He would like to wonder if you have a favorite feature.
In PHP 8?
Mm.
Yeah. Let's go back to my PHP 8 slide.
Personally, I love the constructor property promotion. And Daniel Fanica thinks the same.
Yeah. I mean, it's less typing. That's true. I'd actually go either with named arguments or the null safe operator. Probably the null safe operator, just because in complex code, it's amazing how often people forget to check nulls in a long chain of calls like that. And being able to do that without really thinking about it, just by adding a dot, just by adding a question mark, is going to help a lot. So I go with null safe.
No, there's a lot of code I'm working on that would benefit greatly. Like it would just reduce the accidental complication of it massively. So I really like that one. Okay. Well, another question from Daniel, which is, are we going to have automatic getters and setters next? I would say we already have that with public properties, but
well, public property isn't quite the same as an automatic getter and setter. I don't know. I mean, write an RFC and make a strong case for it if you think that's going to be useful. Offhand, I would say no, but I don't know. I haven't read the RFC for it, so we'll see. If someone comes up and can really make a case, maybe.
Okay, so I got a question from Rob here. Again, he's asking, what are your thoughts on the Rust programming language? Would it be viable to use it in some aspects of PHP development?
I like Rust. I've done a little bit of Rust coding, not a lot. Viable in PHP. I mean, it's not like we're going to switch PHP from C to Rust. That's just not going to happen. You can integrate Rust via Gearman easily today. You don't have to do anything special for that. I could see maybe doing some, if libffi, if that supported Rust at some point, you could maybe FFI it in. But no, I don't see us integrating Rust in any way into sort of the behind the scenes aspects of PHP.
Makes sense. Okay, so I think we've hit the end of the questions here. So I have a few questions myself.
Okay.
So one I was interested in asking you mentioned feature flags. So I use feature flags quite extensively, and I do it in lazy ways, like say with a get param, just so you can get something out of door. But what do you use? Do you use anything more advanced at Etsy? Is there any tooling you use, or is it just whatever gets the job done?
Yes. Did we? I'm trying to think. I don't remember if we open sourced feature or not. Oh man, I should know this offhand. So we do have a feature library that is really quite nice, actually. And I'm just trying to see if we pushed it out. Can someone in Slack tell me? Oh, no one's listening to me on Etsy Slack. Is it out there? Archived. Oh, it's archived. Oh, that's interesting. Okay, so we do actually, if you go to github.com, let's see, we do actually have one here. So github.com Etsy feature. That kind of explains how the feature flagging works. But it's an archive project now, so I guess we haven't been maintaining it, but it might give you a decent start. And it's a good overview of how we do feature flagging at Etsy.
Fantastic. I will be giving a read of that after this. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
So a question about caching. So, still one of the difficult problems. Would you have any tips or advice around caching or anything about how Etsy views caching? Because like I work in older PHP code bases, caching code quickly becomes one of the problematic pieces of code.
Right, but there's so many layers of caching, right? So I'll run through the caching that we do at Etsy. So we have the opcode cache for PHP scripts, obviously, that we have to balance very, very delicately on code deploys. Then the opcache also handles like our application configuration, for example. The fastest way of having a configuration for an application is just to put an array in an include file and let opcache cache it. So in that sense, your entire configuration.php is cached in memory. So that's an easy level, but that's sort of a very, very low level cache. Then on top of that, you might have, for our ORM, for example, we have a query cache, and we have a couple of levels of query caching. We have an in-process query cache that says that if you're doing the same query twice from the same request, you won't have to actually hit an external mechanism the second time, because there's an in-process cache of your recent request from that particular request. So that's just straight in PHP itself. Then there is a memcache in front of the actual database that offloads the database. So that spans requests, right? So if another request has recently made the same query to the database, it'll be in memcache, and you can pull it out of there. There's some Redis caching for other things. So there are many layers of caching, and caching is not, you can't just throw like one cache at something, and it really depends on the type of code that or the type of data that you're caching and the lifetime of this data. How often does it change, right? I had a company ask me the other day about caching millions and millions and millions of records that change every 4 hours. How to do that effectively. And again, one of the interesting things about PHP is just how fast opcache is at caching a file. If you have a read-only array, or if you can stuff your data into an associative array in the file and have it read-only, the way opcache works is that it doesn't have to copy it out of the shared memory segment if you don't change it. So if it's a read-only array, you're just looking up items in it. There's nothing that has to be copied anywhere, and it is faster than anything you can imagine. Even like a local memcache on the same server will get trounced by an array in an include file for PHP. So if it's read-only data like that you never have to update, that's the fastest caching you can do. If you have to write to it all the time, or even every now and then, every couple of minutes or something, then that doesn't work, because then you have to recache this huge file, and that sucks. So then you have to look at something like maybe memcache. You could do local memcache or local Redis on the servers themselves, but that only takes requests from that server, obviously. Then you can push it up and say you have a distributed one, a centralized memcache behind load balancers and stuff, so that all your servers can cache. But no, I mean, the caching question, it's one of the most complex things in computer science, right? There's so many layers to that, and there's so many ways you can cache that I can't give you one answer to how to cache. I can just sort of show the layers that we have at Etsy and what I've done in the past.
Oh no, it's an entire topic, and I realized that after asking it, and we could be here for hours, so it might be a good time to stop on that question. Okay, so let's see. Just going to see, we still have a few more questions here from people. So Michael Paul's asked about your example you showed a bit, your controller and the ORM at Etsy. So he's asking about how do you organize the business logic when it grows too much?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. But basically, the controllers will call into other, so it's very much object oriented. So we have a bunch of classes in different directories, and the autoloader, it goes by the sort of the standard autoloader semantics of the name of the classes in the directory and file that matches the name. And the controllers will just call into those classes, instantiate these classes of the different components that are required for this particular controller. And as long as you keep your object names sane, use some namespacing when necessary, it is possible to keep it mostly clean. I mean, this is not unique to PHP at this level. Once you have a bunch of classes and objects interacting, how you arrange them is kind of just discipline and naming in order to keep things clean and consistent.
Okay, great, good advice. Okay, so we've got a question here from Ken, and he would like, could you explain the name PHP? He says that he knows it's short for people hate Perl, but he doesn't think that's fair on Perl coders.
Yeah, okay, Ken, now you're just trolling me.
Yeah, pretty much.
I mean, it was just a dumb name I came up with originally. Stood for personal home pages, right? Then I had this form interpreter, so it was known as PHP FI for a while, which was kind of a joke on TCP/IP. And then when it grew more and more, I and a couple of the other early developers on it, we were trying to come up with a new name for it. We just ended up just dropping the /fi part and just saying it's just PHP, because at that point there was already books and there were things out there with the name, and it just didn't make any sense to change the name at that point. So that's kind of the history.
So you got, legacy got stuck with the name.
Yeah.
That is always the way.
Yeah, there was
Okay,
not
I
much
think
thought.
those are the things that bite you in the ass, but it seems to have worked out. So here we have a question from Diaz to Dev. He would like to get your thinking when it makes sense to leave something like Nginx and PHP FPM to go to something like React PHP, Swole, etc.
I guess I'm old school. I like the separation, and I like the sort of the architecture of Nginx FPM. It's clean and simple and debuggable for me. So I mean, I'm sure it does make sense depending on your load pattern and the traffic pattern that you have. For Etsy, that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense, because we're pretty much a traditional LAMP type shop with very, very heavy database driven site with lots of requests to the database. So each PHP request is quite heavy. It's not like we are Slack with tons and tons of parallel tiny requests with new messages, for example. That requires a completely different architecture. And I think your serving architecture really has to be guided by the traffic patterns and the types of requests that you're serving. So it's another one of these questions. You can't just say no or yes to that. It depends on your traffic.
Okay, great. I think that is the last question we have from the live chat. And I have just one more question myself. I'm curious about how internally you handle modularization of your code. Do you have any strategies for that? And also maybe a follow-on question to it about how teams are structured.
So Etsy is mono repo. We have one big repo. Everything is in there. Modularization is just done by names, right? Directories within the mono repo. So in that sense, we don't really have modularization, other than sort of by convention and taking good care of our mono repo. There are some big advantages to that. There are some disadvantages to it as well. For me, I like the mono repo because I tend to work across all these teams and across all the code. When I add a new fan check, for example, I have to go and fix all the cases where that fan check is being triggered, no matter who wrote the code or which team is responsible for the code. I'll just sort of do a blanket fix across the entire mono repo. And it's a little easier when I know that, okay, I got the entire thing and I don't have to chase down every separate module out there and in their own separate repos and their own weird branch naming or whatever, right? Which one is the current branch they're working on, which one is not. So in terms of sort of macro management of it, it's easier with a mono repo. It does become cumbersome sometimes when schedules and priorities are not the same and everyone's working within the same repo. So in that sense, I can see the drawbacks of it. And I think you had a second part to your question that I forgot. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, no worries. Well, actually, just to go to that, I definitely agree with mono repos, because, I mean, if you can't do a modular mono repo, then how can you do a modular distributed system? You're just asking for trouble. One of the question I had was about team structures. Oh. So how are teams structured? Are they structured by product? Is it by role, or is it by action? You know, what kind of like, is there any methodology for that, or is it just what works?
That's a very manager level question. I try to avoid even thinking about things like that. But I mean, yeah, I mean, it is role based. I mean, we have a payments team, for example, that handles anything to do with payments, right? We have a security team, we have a fraud team. So in the macro sense, yes, it's by roles that the teams operate on, right? The search team. So all the large aspects of Etsy that you can think of have obvious teams behind them. And then within those teams, you have smaller teams that work on like internationalization of certain pieces of that particular thing, right? My son is on the pricing team. They work on things related to pricing. So yeah, there are teams, and they are split up by role.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, and I think we've got one more question here in the chat, and we could leave it at that. It's a controversial question from Rob Elias. He would like to know how you pronounce the scope resolution operator, the double colon.
You mean you want me to say it in Hebrew?
I have no idea.
No, because that's sort of an inside joke, or not so much inside anymore in PHP, is the double colon. For those of you who don't know, I'm not going to be able to figure that out right now. But no, I can't pronounce the Hebrew. He's just trolling me again. So if you go to the manual page for it, I don't know, are you sharing this now?
Yep, we can see that.
Okay. So basically he's asking me to pronounce this.
There.
And I cannot.
Yeah, I'm not even going to try.
No, there you go.
Okay. That's some top quality trolling. I'm impressed. Some good bants from the chat this evening. Well, okay. I think it's been an hour 20 minutes.
Okay.
This has been a huge success. I don't have any more questions myself. So yeah, I'd like to thank you for coming to PHP Dublin. This has been fantastic. I'd like to thank everyone that has attended. I'd like to say that we're going to pick up these virtual meetups. So if anybody has any idea for a topic or anything, just drop us a message to our Twitter account. And yeah, I think that's that. Rasmus, thank you very much.
Thank you, and thanks for everyone for joining.
Great. All right, everyone. Chat to you later.